Okay, it's 6 o'clock. I know we have a couple people still joining. We had about 50 people registered for this webinar, so we're very excited, and I'm sure people will be popping on as they can. A recording of this webinar will also be sent for everyone who registered, so you can rewatch as you need to. And so we'll kind of get into some introductions and then jump into all things dyslexia. My name is Meredith Gleason, and I'm very excited to be representing Empowered Child Learning and have Rachel Herman on tonight from Learning for All. We're excited to be co-hosting this webinar talking about demystifying dyslexia, and we're going to talk about the identification, assessment, and treatment. We have a very jam-packed presentation for you, so we're going to move and groove through this. We're, like I said, very excited to share this information with you. And so with that, just some Zoom norms as we go through this. This webinar is being recorded, so if you can mute yourself and turn off your video, that would be fantastic. And we will have time at the end to answer questions. You can type them into the chat. I will be monitoring the chat as we go through, and if we don't answer all your questions with the Q&A time we have left, we will definitely send you an email with an answer. So thank you for taking the time to sign up and being here and following those Zoom norms. Just a disclaimer, this information that we're going to be going over tonight isn't used for an individual diagnosis of dyslexia or treatment for dyslexia. This is just community information for whether you're a parent, an educator, someone who works with children with dyslexia in a certain capacity or just wants more information. This is just a general overview. Okay. So before we get into it, I want to go over a little bit about me, and then we're going to go over a little about Rachel and get on into our presentation on dyslexia. So my name is Meredith Gleason, and I am the owner of Empowered Child Learning, and I'm a licensed educational psychologist. And I've been in the field of education for 13 years, worked with kids from preschool to college age. I love all age levels for their various reasons. I myself am a parent. I have a 4-year-old, and then I have a baby girl that's on her way. I'm due in October, very excited. I was a teacher before I was a psychologist, so I have that background as well. And I love my job of being a psychologist. I've worked in public school systems and in private practice, and I love it. It's one of my, it's my passion. I've worked in districts throughout Southern California, so I'm familiar with different models and different systems. I also have received awards and recognition at the district level and at the county level for supporting students with disabilities. I think that's because of my passion for empowering students and empowering their families and helping families and students really understand their child's learning profile, their strengths, their weaknesses, navigating their world if they have a disability, and how to make how to make their strengths really shine and how to navigate through their day-to-day life to increase emotional well-being in their academic experience. I specialize in childhood anxiety, ADHD, autism, and dyslexia. Those are not the only areas I diagnose, but those are the areas I specialize in. To talk a little bit briefly more about Empowered Child Learning Services before I turn it over to Rachel, I do primarily assessment. And so what that really means, if you're unfamiliar with that term, I do typically what's called a psychoeducational assessment. And that's where I'm looking at the way a child thinks, the cognitive part, the academics, how they perform in reading, writing, and math, and then the social, emotional, behavioral piece, where I'm looking at how their emotional well-being is, their social skills, their behavior, and seeing how those are all related, because they very much are. And one can definitely influence the other. And from that, I give diagnoses to children that when they meet criteria. Based on the assessments, and I also include recommendations, which I'll go into later. I do specialized assessments where I do look at specific areas of diagnoses that parents ask or often to pinpoint, like ADHD, autism, anxiety, if they want me to narrow, versus the broader psychoeducational comprehensive assessment. I also look at something called executive functioning, which, if you're unfamiliar with that term and you're like, what did she just say? It is if the brain is an orchestra, it's the conductor of our brain. It's the frontal lobe where we learn we use to plan, organize, remember information, navigate our day, move from one thing to the next. And then I have a intervention program called Seeing My Time. So if a child does have executive functioning deficits, after I do an assessment, I have an intervention program. I also do parent coaching for parents if their children receive special education services, if they're on a 504 IEP. I provide behavioral strategies for parents to use at home, help them kind of digest the child's disability and really work on that demystification support. It's one of my favorite parts of my job. I've also been helping parents navigate distance learning as well through this process and time that we're all in. And then lastly, I do student counseling as well. And I work on executive functioning skills, like I mentioned, through my Seeing My Time program that I have. And then I also do mental health counseling for anxiety, any kind of emotional management needs where coping strategies are often needed to be learned and incorporated. Okay. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to share information about her and her fabulous company, Learning for All.
Thank you so much, Meredith. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful to Meredith for allowing me to join her in this webinar, and Learning for All is really excited to partner with Empower Child Learning because together we can provide comprehensive services for families who have students who are struggling with learning for a lot of different reasons. And so it's always great to have professional partnerships where we know that we can take good care of our families across a spectrum of needs that they might have. So as Meredith said, my name is Rachel Herman. I'm the founder and executive director of Learning for All, and we're a full service educational therapy center. We actually have 3 clinics in San Diego, in Point Loma, Kensington, and Scripps Ranch, where we see learners from ages 4 to adult in our clinics. We also have a full service online virtual program as well. So we actually work with students from all over the country on our online platforms, which is really exciting. I founded Learning for All in 2014, and before that, I have 25 years of experience in education, from working with my kids. I homeschooled for 13 years. I worked in various different educational settings from elementary through high school. I also taught college for 6 years at Point Loma Nazarene University. So I've had a diverse experience with education, but I think I feel that at this point in my life, I'm at my most fulfilled because I have such a passion for working with students who learn differently. And a lot of that passion came out of my experience with my own son. I have 3 boys actually, but I have a son who's turning 21 next week who has experienced dyslexia, ADHD, and auditory processing disabilities. And he was really the reason that my life sort of took a turn from one side of education to another side over 10 years ago. And ever since then, it's been my desire to just find out more and more about how I can help students who learn differently. So I'm a professionally certified educational therapist. I'm an internationally certified Feuerstein cognitive enrichment provider, which is when we're thinking about cognition, we're thinking about how the brain works and processes information and what kind of cognitive deficiencies might be impeding our progress in learning. I specialize in working with dyslexia, ADHD, twice exceptional students, and also adult learners who are struggling with learning for various reasons. I do a lot of consulting, I do a lot of training, and I also do a lot of one-on-one therapy with learners of all different profiles. So sharing a little bit more about Learning for All and the services that we provide. As I said before, we're a full-service educational therapy center. So we have certified educational therapists as well as therapeutic tutors on our staff. We work primarily on academic or functional remediation along with cognitive skill building. So one of the things that sets our services apart is that for every student that we see, there's a personalized therapy plan. It's developed especially for them based on testing that we might receive from the amazing psychologists we work with, like Meredith, who provide that comprehensive standardized testing for us. We also do functional assessments with all of our learners so that we're able to gather data based on how that child is actually processing information in real time. So it's one thing to get a diagnostic report with standardized numbers, and it's another thing to see that child work, to give them specific academic tasks and see where those things are breaking down for them. So all of our therapy plans are a synthesis of those two things: the standardized testing results that we get and the functional assessment that we do. And together we're able to provide a comprehensive plan for that child. We work with lots of different types of learners and lots of different types of challenges that might make it difficult for someone to learn. So whether that be a processing disability like dyslexia, where the brain has trouble processing information and giving us the output that we're expecting, whether it's an intellectual disability, a developmental disability, or an acquired disability, so something like a traumatic brain injury, PTSD, or trauma. All of those things also frequently impact learning. So our focus is really on the learning part. How do we re-jumpstart that cognition, maybe in a student who's experienced a challenge like a TBI, or how do we help create those new neural connections, those new neural pathways for learning for students who have processing and other types of learning disabilities. We work with students from ages 4 to adult, as I said before, either in person in our clinics or online. That's our primary mission and our primary goal. We also, especially with all of the stuff that has happened with the pandemic in the last 6 months, we're providing a lot of academic support for distance learning as well. So we have brand new programs that we're rolling out for fall, which involve one-on-one academic support as well as small group learning pods. So we're have families that are creating customized learning pods, and our teachers and therapists are facilitating those, as well as we'll be running some learning pods of our own that families can join. So if that's something that is a challenge during this distance learning time, that's a service that we're also providing. We do functional assessments, a lot of parent consultation, and training, professional development, and community outreach. So just quickly, our mission is on the next slide there, Meredith. We're passionate about helping learners of all ages who struggle academically with those main academic subjects: spelling, reading, writing, math, and students who struggle cognitively with topics such as attention, memory, reasoning, and critical thinking skills. So all of our learners come as a multifaceted person with different challenges. So it's so important that we understand all of the different areas where a learner is struggling, so that we can create a plan that addresses all of those needs, not just one or two of them. All of our approaches that we're going to talk about, what makes a good intervention, personalized and multisensory, and some other aspects that we'll talk about to help students develop those new neural pathways. So our motto is, we teach thinking so everyone can learn. So that's a little bit about learning for all. And then we're going to jump in and talk about dyslexia. I know that's why all of you are here. And so it's really wonderful to have such a great turnout on the topic of dyslexia, because as we're going to discover, dyslexia is the most prevalent learning disability and one of the most misunderstood. And there's a lot of reasons for that. In California, in particular, the term dyslexia has not been widely used in the schools, and we've had some wonderful legislation passed in the last couple of years that has allowed us now to bring that language into IEPs for special education. But even with that addition, that understanding and that foundation is not there for so many of us. So we're going to take like Meredith said, we have a lot to cover, but we want to make sure that you leave today with an understanding of what dyslexia is, an understanding of how it's identified, an understanding of what it looks like in the learner, and finally an understanding of what do we do about it? How do we remediate dyslexia? So we hope those 4 takeaways will be a part of your experience today. So the first thing that we want to cover is, what is dyslexia? And I always like to start with this definition, which is kind of a mouthful, so we're going to unpack it. But this is the definition that comes to us from the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. And so we're going to kind of look at this piece by piece. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurological in origin. So what does that mean? It's a specific learning disability. It is a different brain organization. It is not a typical way of processing. So one of the things that I think is so important to understand about dyslexia is that dyslexia is because it's a different type of brain organization, it comes with amazing strengths and amazing weaknesses together. So we call it a learning disability. That term I don't always love, because there are two sides to that coin. For every cognitive weakness, there's also a cognitive strength. And so one of the things that we know about our kids, our learners, children and adults who have dyslexia, is that their brain does some things really well, exceptionally well, better than neurotypical learners. But it has really struggles with some other things that have to do with language processing. So with respect to what we end up doing as learners for, the first 18 years of our life, which is focused on learning in an academic setting, dyslexia is a disability because it makes academic learning much more challenging. So what I love to say when I work with my students who have dyslexia, I like them to think about their brains. We talk a lot about brains and how they work and what our strengths and our weaknesses are. And I love to tell them that some of those amazing strengths that students with dyslexia have, things like really incredible spatial reasoning, really creative out-of-the-box thinking, really amazing ability to sort of make connections that other people don't see. Often our kids that have dyslexia are great athletes, they're great entrepreneurs, they're great artists. They have these skills that I can't teach them as a therapist. The reading and the spelling, we can teach that. We can work on that. So all of these things are important to remember when we're talking to our kids. That even though dyslexia is a learning disability with respect to language processing, there are also beautiful strengths that go alongside. But it is a different brain organization. So in that, with that understanding, it just means that their brain processes differently, and we need to give them different strategies in order to learn how to work with language. What are its characteristics? It's characterized by difficulties with accurate and or fluent word recognition and by poor spelling and decoding disabilities. So where we most prominently see dyslexia is in difficulty with reading and difficulty with spelling. Those are the primary places that we see dyslexia that pop up as red flags. And we're going to talk about some other warning signs as well. These difficulties typically result from a deficit in the phonological component of language that is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. Whew, that's a lot in one sentence. Phonological component of language is the sounds that we hear. So at its core, dyslexia is a difficulty with understanding how the sounds of language relate to the symbols of language. And there are different types of dyslexia that have strengths and weaknesses related to sounds and symbols. But at its core, that's the first piece that we remediate, that phonological processing. Do I understand the sounds that are coming in? Can I accurately identify them? Can I manipulate them? And can I match them to the symbols that go with them, the language symbols? So that's letters and letter combinations. So that is the deficit. What's remarkable about dyslexia is that, and why it's so surprising and why it's so often missed or misdiagnosed, is because it's unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. So most learners with dyslexia have average to high intelligence. And that's not true across the board. We see dyslexia in learners who also have intellectual disabilities as well. But the most common presentation of dyslexia has nothing to do with any kind of intellectual disability. In fact, there's a prevalence of dyslexia actually in children who have high IQ scores, high intelligence. We call those kids twice exceptional. And my son was one of those kids. High IQ, low academic performance, and the disparity between those two things is the red flag that this is a learning disability, not something else that sometimes might get blamed for why that child is struggling. So it's we see an unexpected disparity between cognitive ability and performance in academics. And it's not a lack of effective classroom instruction. So that's also important. Or a lack of, parental exposure to language. I didn't read to my child enough. They watched too much TV when they were little. They had a bad teacher in first grade. Sometimes those things happen, but those things do not cause dyslexia. They might cause a learner sometimes to not advance as quickly in language, but dyslexia is something more than that. The secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension and reduced reading experience that can impede the growth of vocabulary and background knowledge. And this is really important to understand too, because dyslexia is a mechanical deficit in reading and spelling. But that mechanical deficit, especially the longer it goes untreated, impacts learning with language overall. So it impacts vocabulary acquisition. If a child isn't reading at their intellectual level, if they're reading at a kindergarten level and they're a fifth grader, they're not getting the language, they're not getting the vocabulary that they would get from reading at their intellectual level. And so what we see is that even though dyslexia itself is not a comprehension issue with respect to language, that it causes issues with comprehension if it goes untreated, because children don't have the exposure to language that they need to learn if they're not reading effectively. So that's an important distinction to make. And some of you might have questions about that too that we can answer at the end. There are learning disabilities that specifically have to do with comprehension of language, whether that's reading comprehension or listening comprehension. That's one thing why it's so important to get the right kind of professional help, so that you can understand whether your student is having trouble with comprehension because they have a mechanical learning, a reading disability like dyslexia, or whether they have more of a perceptual disability related to understanding language as opposed to the mechanical parts. So that has to be parsed out when we're creating a therapy plan for a learner. But this is a basic working definition for dyslexia, and that gave us a lot of sort of launching off points to talk about more as we go on here. So one of the things I think that's helpful is to understand what dyslexia is not. So that was a very full definition of what dyslexia is. Here's some things that dyslexia is not. Dyslexia is not a sign of poor intelligence. Children with dyslexia, again, typically this is not an intellectual disability, and in many cases there are very significant intellectual advantages of this differently organized brain of the dyslexic child. But it's not an intellectual disability, it's a processing disability. So these kids don't have trouble with thinking itself, they have trouble with what do I do with language. My brain doesn't know what to do with it when that language comes in. I don't know what to do with it. It's not a result of laziness or not caring, and this is also so important. So many of our learners who have challenges with learning and learning disabilities in school, especially if they're kind of in that gray area and they go for a while without being diagnosed, struggling, right, but kind of keeping up, but not really, they will often get sort of categorized as, oh, they're just not interested, oh, they're just not motivated, oh, they're just not trying very hard. In my experience, and probably Meredith would say the same, kids want to learn. Kids want to be successful. That's what they want. When we start to see behaviors that come out of struggles with learning, it's usually because they feel defeated. They are self-protecting. They've tried this before and it didn't work out well for them. So they say, oh, that's boring. That's too easy for me. Or that's too hard. I can't do it. Or that's just not fun. I'm not interested in that, right? Those can all be forms of self-protection and task avoidance when a task is difficult.
Absolutely. See that a lot.
Yeah, and we see that all the time. And even, as adults in life, you can imagine if you're trying to do a task, if you're going to work every day and your boss is expecting you to do something every day, and you're trying to understand it, but you just simply don't know how to do it. You don't have the tools that you need to do this task. one of two things is going to happen. You're either going to reject the task and say, you know, I can't do it, give me another job, I'm not interested in that, I can't do that, or you're going to keep trying and failing, or you're, you know, you're going to get frustrated and walk away, and that's what happens to our kids. So oftentimes, again, you know, those behaviors are not because these are bad kids or they don't care or they're lazy. It's because they don't have the tools and they don't have any resource in order to get them. So that's just really important to understand. And that's one of the things that's so exciting about my job, is that when we, in therapy, when we get kids that, you know, are fifth graders reading at a kindergarten level and they've never been successful at reading, and, you know, 2 or 3 months into their program, they're reading things that they never thought that they could read before, and now all of a sudden they understand how to read. They are so motivated and they're so grateful, and they go from, you know, the disinterested learner who's a behavior problem, right, to the learner who's totally invested because they realize, wow, it wasn't that I was stupid, it's that nobody ever taught me the way that my unique brain needed to learn this information. So we see amazing transformations with kids and their attitudes because they want this information. They want to know how to do this and be successful. Dyslexia is not a disease. Dyslexia is a different brain organization, and you'll have dyslexia, that different brain, your whole life. The exciting thing is that we know that the last 30 years of research has shown us that the brain is a plastic organ and that it can grow and learn. So we can create new neural pathways where they didn't exist before, but there is no cure for dyslexia. So that is good and bad. Some things will always be more challenging for learners who have that differently organized brain. But as we talked about before, those amazing strengths and beautiful gifts and skills that come with dyslexia are also a part of you forever. So those are important to remember. Dyslexia is not a lack of educational opportunity. We discussed that a little bit. It can't be cured with pills or diets, and sometimes we see, you know, these magic bullet cures for dyslexia. Diet is important. Exercise is important. There are a lot of things that are important for our overall health and can impact our overall health and can impact us, help students who have learning challenges to deal with those better, but none of those things are a cure for dyslexia. Only an evidence-based, specific program to remediate the challenges that go with dyslexia create lasting improvements in reading and spelling. Dyslexia is also not an eye problem, and this is just the classic misunderstanding of dyslexia, that dyslexia means that you see letters backwards. So that's a myth that we want to clear up right away. Dyslexics don't see letters backwards, but they have trouble with directionality, so they have difficulty remembering the direction of things, especially symbols like letters on paper. Now, what's amazing about that is that the reason that students with dyslexia have so much trouble with directionality is that they actually think more in 3 dimensions. So they actually have a higher level of visual spatial reasoning typically than neurotypical kids. And because of that, they tend to think about the world in 3 dimensions. So if you think about the letters B, D, P, and Q, the shape of those letters, they're all the same shape. They're just pointing different directions, right? But in 3 dimensions, they would all look the same. You could rotate them around and they would be the exact same shape. So it's not that dyslexics see those letters backwards, it's just they have trouble remembering which direction they go when they're in 2 dimensions on a piece of paper, and they need some tricks to help them check and sort of get that solid for them which direction those letters go. And the other thing to remember about dyslexia is it can't be outgrown. So dyslexia is not something that goes away over time. And on the next slide, we'll get a chance to see what that kind of looks like over time. Actually, it's the next slide after this one. So talking about the neurological impact, one of the things that we shared in that original definition is that dyslexia is a specific learning disability that's neurological in origin. So it's a different brain organization. And here we can actually see what that looks like in the reading brain. And this comes actually from a great book that I highly recommend. This is Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz. This is an older edition. I think there's a new cover of it now, but I highly recommend this book if you're interested in learning more about dyslexia and more about the research behind both the methodologies that we use and our understanding of dyslexia as a different brain organization. She did really groundbreaking work at Yale University in understanding the different brain organization of dyslexia. And here you just see a picture of it. In the top view, we have a normal view, and those colored spots that you'll notice on the brain are the spots that light up when a neurotypical learner is reading. So these are the parts of the brain that they're using for reading. If you notice on the bottom, we have a dyslexic brain, and notice that different spots are lighting up when they're doing the same task. Different parts of their brain are lighting up. So the dyslexic brain, dyslexics actually are using a different parts of their brain for reading than neurotypical learners. The neurotypical learners are using the most efficient parts of their brain for reading. Dyslexic learners are using inefficient parts of their brain that they're kind of trying to marshal for this task of reading, but they're not really meant for reading. And so that makes their reading more inefficient. And so because of that, reading is slower, it takes longer to travel through. Oftentimes it gets jumbled and mixed up in the brain. And this is kind of just a really simple explanation and view of why we see that. On the next slide, Meredith will look at what happens when we don't treat dyslexia over time. So on the left, you'll notice this is a graph showing the link between IQ and reading ability. So on the top line of that graph is an IQ trajectory. So in neurotypical learners, in the green on the left, you'll notice that there's an IQ trajectory from, you know, first grade to 12th grade, right? It's this nice curve that's ascending over time. IQ is growing over time as a child goes through school and they keep learning. In a neurotypical child, the bottom line, that hashed line, is the line of reading ability. So in a neurotypical child, reading ability and IQ are tracking together. As a child's IQ grows and they learn more, their reading ability grows right along with it. And that's what we would expect to see. In a learner with dyslexia, we have a very different kind of graph. So on the top, we still have the IQ graph, and that's basically still the same. It's still going up on the same trajectory. But notice on the bottom, that hashed line of the reading is getting shallower and shallower the older that child gets as it's not remediated. So instead of the reading ability tracking with the IQ ability, it is actually falling off in relationship to the IQ ability. So as we said before, you don't outgrow dyslexia. If dyslexia is left untreated, it will get worse and worse over time. The child will improve. Notice that it's still going up, right? And sometimes we'll hear this in school too. Oh, well, he's reading better than he was last year, especially sometimes in SPED programs. Oh, you know, well, he's definitely better than he was 9 months ago. And next year, yeah, well, he's improving. It's just a little of a slower rate. Well, the problem is that slower rate compounds over time, and that gap becomes greater and greater. And so we want to be able to bring those children's reading level up so that just like neurotypical children, it tracks along with their IQ level rather than diverging and getting bigger. All right, a few quick facts about dyslexia. And I may cut some of this short, Meredith, too. I know I'm going a little bit over time. I know I have less on the other end, though, so we'll do a few more minutes here. Dyslexia is hereditary. So Meredith and I both take history, and when we see that family history, that's a big indicator oftentimes that we will want to be looking out for those red flags in children when we have parents and other family members who have symptoms of dyslexia in their family history. It occurs on a spectrum from mild to profound. So you could have a parent with profound dyslexia and a child with mild, and vice versa. So it's definitely not the same in every child, either in severity or in presentation. Dyslexia is common. 1 in 5 students are somewhere on that continuum of dyslexia from severe to profound. In special ed, kids that are tested for special ed, 70 to 80% have a deficit in reading, which is most commonly dyslexia. So it's by far the most common learning disability that we see, and it's the most common cause of reading and spelling problems. And let's see a couple more on the next one. Males and females equally, it impacts equally across socioeconomic and ethnic backgrounds. Again, we see other kinds of learning problems sometimes in different socioeconomic classes that don't have as much access to great education, but it's not dyslexia. Dyslexia is proportionate across. It's really whether those kids are able to get remediation and good help for it or not. So that's one thing that is important to note, that it impacts equally. It's really about that remediation piece. It's often misdiagnosed and misunderstood. It affects more than just reading and spelling. And we've touched on the fact that it affects comprehension as well, because if you can't get the language in, you can't learn the language itself. But dyslexia can also profoundly affect some of those executive functionings that Meredith was talking about, things like planning, organizing, prioritizing, the ability to think sequentially, the ability to follow multi-step directions, the ability to synthesize information that you only get in one modality. So if mom's just giving me a list of 10 things and I just heard it, I can't remember those things. Or if I have just a list visually that I see, I can't remember those things. I need to have some kind of integration of that sensory input. So there are a lot of ways that that dyslexia impacts beyond just reading and spelling, and especially the longer it goes unremediated, we see impact in other areas as well. Dyslexia can't be cured, as we discussed, but we can develop new neural pathways. We have amazing, amazing success and results of teaching kids with dyslexia to read and spell. And that's because their brain is an amazing organ that can learn and grow. It just needs the right kinds of input in order for that to happen. Meredith, do you want me to keep going here, or do you want to? I realize we're a little over time for this part.
That's okay. I think you could just maybe, I'm happy to jump in, or if you want to keep going and go over a couple, and then we'll keep on moving.
Okay, I'll try to go quickly, and I know this is a lot of information. We're going to have this, you'll be able to get a recording and also the slides as well. So you can go back and look at some of this again. I know we're moving quickly. There are several different types of dyslexia. I'm just going to kind of leave this on the slide just so you know. The first type has more to do with that auditory input, with the phonemic awareness and phonological processing, that just phonetic dyslexia, and there's some other names for that as well. Surface dyslexia, and the other names as well, has more to do with the visual processing. So more to do with remembering sight words, being able to picture words and symbols in our head. And finally, mixed dyslexia, which contains both the phonemic awareness piece, the listening piece, auditory piece, and also the visual piece, the symbol piece. So a lot of students have both of those together, and it can also occur with a deficit in what we call rapid automatic naming, which is the ability to pull language quickly. So then sometimes you'll see that called RAN. So difficulty with rapid naming, finding language. So that's, you know, when kids will see that thing and it's the, what do you call it? It's the thingamajig, right? It's the plate. But we can't get that word at that moment. So that's an example of struggle with RAN, rapid automatic naming. So those are just some different types. Here are some signs and symptoms you might see in your learners, and these kind of goes from young to older, but you'll see these throughout the lifespan of students who struggle with dyslexia. Delayed speech often. My son didn't speak in regular language until he was almost 2, my son who has dyslexia. Chronic ear infections can also impact that because chronic ear infections impact that development of auditory processing in the first 5 years of development. So students can often have an auditory processing deficit, which can very much be part of dyslexia due to chronic ear infections when they were young. Late to establish a dominant hand, so constantly switching back between left and right. And we even get some older students in our office who will write with either both left and right. And so choosing that dominant hand becomes important for motor memory for writing. Confusion between left and right, difficulty rhyming, difficulty remembering anything that's a sequence, so alphabet, phone number, address, times tables. Letter and number reversals can be a symptom past usually about 2nd grade. It's developmentally appropriate for students to reverse letters and numbers in those first couple years of school. But if you're seeing that 2nd grade and beyond, that would be a red flag. illegible handwriting, or never being able to master handwritings. Difficulty with motor control can be an associated challenge. Poor spelling, slow, choppy, and inaccurate reading, extreme anxiety about school and learning. So those stomach aches, you know, before every spelling test, those headaches that make me want to stay home from school on those days when I know I'm going to have to read aloud in front of the class. Skipping or misreading words or parts of words when reading aloud, especially suffixes. So if you notice that your child's reading aloud to you and they're skipping or they're misreading or they're guessing at words or they're inserting a word that makes sense in context, but it's not, doesn't have anything to do phonetically with the word that's there. So they might see a picture of a child jumping into a body of water and the sentence says the boy jumped into the lake, and they read the boy jumped into the pond. Okay, pond and lake have nothing to do with each other either phonetically or visually, right? They're guessing at that word. They didn't recognize the word lake. They're inserting a word that goes with the context of the picture. That's a big red flag that they're not actually reading. They're guessing based on context, and they're using the context clues of understanding the subject of what they're reading or looking at the picture in order to attempt those words. The inability to sound out unknown words is a red flag. The inability to remember sight words for reading and or spelling. Difficulty finding the correct word for speech. That's that rapid naming, or what we call word retrieval, finding that word in their memory. Confusing or transposing sounds or symbols. And transposing sounds, so it might be something like saying Paschetti instead of spaghetti, right? Those phonemes are all in there, but now we're putting them in a different order. Cinnamon instead of cinnamon. So those are, again, common clues that that auditory piece is weak. Poor written expression, especially as compared to verbal output. So when you ask your child, tell me about our trip to Disneyland, and they give you, you know, 15 minutes of just beautiful description about, you know, the Matterhorn and how tall it was and that scary monster at the top, and you know, they can go on and give you, you know, a whole thesis about their experience at Disneyland, and then you ask them to write a paragraph about Disneyland, and they write, we went to Disneyland, it was hot, I had fun. Okay, they haven't given you any of that description. They haven't given you any of the expression that they would if they just had to tell it to you. That's a clue that they have trouble getting that down onto paper. Maybe they don't know how to use gorgeous, scary monster, abominable snowman, because the abominable, how in the world would I ever spell that word? I can't use that word, right? So we substitute words that are easy and simple for us because we don't have the tools that we need to express ourselves in writing at the level of our thinking or at the level of our verbal output. So poor written expression as compared to verbal output, and then difficulty reading music or learning a foreign language. So those are some primary warning signs that you might notice in your learners that would be a red flag that we should really look a little bit deeper and see if this learner might be struggling with dyslexia. Okay, quickly, a couple of other things I just wanted to mention, that dyslexia often doesn't occur in a vacuum. It often co-occurs with other challenges that go along with a differently organized brain. And a lot of these have to do with processing as well. So we find that students who have challenges with processing can have challenges with processing in multiple areas. So one of the most common combinations that we see in our clinic is dyslexia with ADHD. And this can be very challenging because the ADHD affecting the focus and attention, often auditory or visual memory and attention, make it more difficult to remediate the other piece. We have wonderful protocols that work with that, and in the clinic it's not as much of an issue, but in the classroom it's huge. It's a huge challenge to overcome when you have dyslexia with ADHD in the classroom, where the stimulation is going on all the time, and the pace of the class is quick, and you don't get to stop and ask questions and all the other things. That's a whole nother webinar. We could talk about how that manifests itself in a classroom and what kind of challenges are associated with that. But dyslexia and ADHD are common comorbidity. On an IEP, you'll see specific learning disability. The irony there being that on an IEP, it's usually not very specific. So
Right.
the language will usually be a visual processing disability or auditory processing disability, which are, again, very large, broad categories and very general. So when we get a child in our clinic, and when Meredith works with kids too, and we get those assessments, it allows us to drill down and really give a specific diagnosis and a specific plan, as opposed to these really broad categories that don't tell us a lot. They tell us there's a problem, they don't necessarily tell us what it is. Auditory and visual processing deficit, again, you'll see dysgraphia, which is a specific learning disability in writing, dyscalculia, which is a specific learning disability in math, executive functioning deficits, which may or may not co-occur with ADHD, but pretty much every student that has ADHD has issues with executive functioning, but you can have executive functioning deficits without ADHD. And again, that's Meredith's area. When we get her report, she's able to tell us exactly what we're working with when we're developing that therapy plan for the child. We also might see nonverbal or perceptual reasoning deficits. So sometimes it's called NVLD, nonverbal learning disability, and this has more to do with comprehension pieces, both for visual information or for verbal information. But those can also co-occur with dyslexia as well. And finally, we work with a lot of twice exceptional students with very high IQs who have learning disabilities, and there are special challenges that go along with that profile as well. All right, Meredith.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a lot of great information, and we're so glad that you were able to share that with us. And one of the reasons I was so excited to partner with you for this, because I know you have such an extensive experience and background. So we're going to talk about the assessment process. So like Rachel said, that's where I come in. I do assessments for dyslexia. I do comprehensive assessments. And so what you see here is kind of pieces I would pinpoint to look at dyslexia. So I always like to include a cognitive assessment, which looks at a child's thinking abilities. So I'm really looking at what is their verbal comprehension? How are they acquiring vocabulary and knowledge from the world around them? This is something they pick up from going to school, language used at home, things like that. So that's a component that I want to see. I also want to see how are they problem solving, something called fluid reasoning or this planning ability. When they're given visual information, can they determine a pattern? Can they find a piece that's missing in a situation? So these kind of problem solving skills can be linked with executive functioning, and they can also be linked with reading comprehension. So it's really important that I understand where they're at with that. And as Rachel shared earlier, IQ is important to see, like that graph she showed, to see how the gap might look between a child's cognitive ability, which is their potential, and then their academic performance, which may be impacted if they have dyslexia, may be impacted in reading and or certain specific areas of reading. But dyslexia, like she mentioned, can also affect other subject areas as well. So IQ isn't required for a diagnosis, but it's definitely a meaningful piece of information that I use as an assessor to drive my recommendations and diagnoses. So I also look at psychological processing. So like Rachel was saying, there's different parts of our brain that need to do certain skills and need to help us interpret information that we're taking in. So that executive functioning piece, we've talked about a lot already. That attention piece is, a lot of times attention is looped in with executive functioning, and there's multiple ways you can measure that processing area. Also, I look at phonological processing and auditory processing. Rachel kind of went over phonological processing in detail. It's a way, we look at, can a child, when I'm testing a child, I'm looking at, can they blend sounds? Can they segment sounds and words that I give them? Can they manipulate them? So if I say, can you say cup without the k sound? I'm looking for them to say up. Or can you say the word cat but replace the k sound with a b sound? I'm looking for them to say bat. So those skills orally, they need to be able to do before they can read and associate those sounds with symbols and letters on paper. I also look at auditory processing because, like Rachel said, that can be a component as well that we need to know. It's a piece of the puzzle. Assessments are pieces of the puzzle I'm putting together to make a comprehensive picture of a child. Memory is important, short-term memory and long-term memory. Long-term memory can also be examined through those rapid naming skills. Look, and then Rachel talked about that, pulling that information out of your brain, that language associated skill, and rapid naming skills are also paired with visual information. So for example, when I assess that, I'm having a child read or say to me as quickly numbers row by row or letters row by row, and I'm timing them because they need to be able to do it efficiently. And that translates to reading efficiently. We have to have that fluency to be able to read quickly enough that it makes sense for them to comprehend later. So if that fluency is impacted, we usually see that comprehension is also impacted too. And that can also be because of that rapid naming skill. I want to look at visual perception. Surface dyslexia is associated with visual perception deficits, and I want to know to what degree and how those manifest. And there can also be visual processing areas that impact a child, not just dyslexia, but in other potential diagnoses as well. And then processing speed. So it's actually an area that's so important across so many academic areas. Processing speed is how quickly and efficiently we can do a simple task or a given task. It's measured with paper, pencil, and visual information. And we want to see how efficient that work output is kind of telling of processing speed. I also look at social, emotional, and behavioral components because like Rachel said, there's a comorbidity. So if I'm just looking at a child's cognitive ability, their processing, and their academics, I'm actually missing a piece of the puzzle. I need to look at how I need to look at their emotional well-being. I need to look at their behavioral abilities to see if there's a potential for ADHD. Sometimes children, especially as they get older when they have dyslexia, that gap that they're seeing between their peers and themselves can sometimes cause anxiety or even depression, a low sense of self-worth. So I always, especially if a kid is in those upper grades, I always want to look at their social emotional well-being because that comorbidity can definitely be a factor. I also do observations in the classroom. That's obviously been very different. I do observations during Zoom lessons. I've adapted and worked that way and do assessment observations during that as well. And then interviews always provide so much information because what I'm really seeing from a child during their testing sessions is a snapshot of how they're performing in certain tasks. But, parents, teachers, coaches, people that they're relevant that work with them, people like Rachel who work with children in her educational therapy setting, they can really provide additional information that helps me, once again, put this puzzle together. I also want to look at academics because processing abilities correlate to how children are going to perform academically. If you have a processing deficit, you could have some academic deficits as a result. And I have a graph on the next page that kind of shows how they all line up. So when I look at academic achievement, I'm looking at reading, I'm looking at decoding, that ability to manipulate sounds and how that transfers to them, a child being able to read words, including reading nonsense words. Sometimes children memorize words and are very good at that piece. So they fool us by thinking they have phonemic and phonological awareness, but they actually don't. And so when you look at nonsense words, made up words, but that are follow a phonological pattern and they can't read it, that's very telling that they haven't acquired the necessary decoding skills that they need, and they might have a phonological processing deficit. That's the reasoning for that. I also look at reading fluency. I want to hear a child read. I want to look at their miscues. Are they mispronouncing, guessing words, things like that Rachel went over. I need to know and watch and see how that unfolds. And then comprehension. I'm looking at are they able to not just answer those simple detail questions like, how many bears were in the story? 3. I'm looking at how can they do those inferential questions, those reading between the lines, because that can be, if that's difficult, it can be linked with not only dyslexia, but executive functioning deficits. I'm looking at written expression. So I'm looking at spelling, sentence composition, and a writing sample. If a child's old enough, there's an essay portion. If a child is not old enough, I either get a writing sample or use another form to get information of what their writing as a whole looks like. Children with dyslexia often have difficulty with spelling. Sometimes children with dyslexia have really grasped strategies to compensate. So they might do great or okay on an individual spelling task, but then when you're asking them to spell in a writing sample, you see a lot of misspellings, and you start to see the punctuation and grammar kind of unravel, because writing sentences and writing an essay or a response to a prompt takes a lot of executive functioning skills. You're planning, organizing, paying attention to your spelling, your letter formation, a lot of things. So usually what happens is the spelling, the punctuation, the legibility kind of drop off. And that's often what I see. Listening comprehension can be an area where a child has difficulty. That's another layer that we want to look at when we look at learning disabilities, and that can have overlap with dyslexia. Oral expression as well, what the output is of their verbal abilities. And then what's really interesting with math, children that have deficits with fluency, like reading fluency, and have dyslexia, such as surface dyslexia, and the fluency academically usually impacts them all the way down. So writing fluency will be impacted, and then math fact fluency will be impacted, meaning they have trouble with that efficiency or recalling information quickly and accurately, that rapid naming skill, which can affect their ability to recall math facts such as like addition, subtraction, multiplication in a fluid manner. And that can later catch up with them as they're trying to do all these multi-step word problems as they get older. So I always, I see links with that often as well. So the chart I wanted to show you all is on this page. This is adapted from a psychologist, Milton Dean, who developed a patterns of strengths and weaknesses model. So this is just how psychological processing areas that I went over link to the academic piece. This isn't the full chart. I just picked the pieces that we usually see impact with dyslexia. So you can kind of see how different parts such as auditory processing, long-term recall, which is that rapid naming, long-term memory skill. You can see phonological processing affecting different areas. So if a child has phonological processing deficits, they may have deficits in those basic reading decoding skills, but they might also have deficits in reading fluency. And then that can affect their written language as well. So we see a lot of these secondary consequences, like Rachel mentioned, that can which is why it's so important to get that comprehensive picture of a child so we can line up all their areas. And sometimes children, like Rachel said, have fascinating strengths. They have really great fluid reasoning, and they're able to comprehend what they're reading, even though they might have a phonological processing deficit. And we do see that catch up with them at certain points, which is why remediation early is important. But I do see children with fantastic coping strategies that they just have adapted themselves. And so there's so many strengths that come with dyslexia, as Rachel mentioned, that I love that she highlighted. Just to kind of give an overview, I take all this information of testing and rating scales and interviews and all this information, and I put it together in a very healthy, meaty report that gives you a lot of information as a parent. I give a diagnosis for dyslexia or other diagnoses that are warranted. I provide recommendations and treatment, or recommendations for treatment. And that's where someone like Rachel would come in. I do educationally relevant diagnoses, like I mentioned, using the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual practitioners use. The individual recommendations can be both at home and at school. So I'm able to give explicit things the family can do at home to enhance skill deficit areas, to improve those, as well as giving them guidance towards educational therapy, such as Learning for All, and support if they need maybe additional evaluation in speech and language, occupational therapy, if they need counseling because there's a comorbidity between dyslexia and anxiety, I offer that as well. So really giving that kind of parent walking away with like, I feel like I have a plan. That's what I want for all my parents. There's a lot of anxiety and strong emotions you can have when your child receives a diagnosis. And I want to arm parents with information. I think that's so important. Okay. And I also give accommodations for schools to use, whether it's recommendations for certain programs, modifications, accommodations, recommendations for, evaluation for an IEP or 504, different behavior support strategies. So I try to be comprehensive to give both sides. I know we're short on time, so I'm going to just go through this very quickly. Sometimes parents want to know what's the difference between school assessment and a private assessment for dyslexia. Schools are looking at a child's eligibility for special education. So there's educational code that you follow if you're in the public school realm that is tied to specific learning disability criteria. So if they meet that criteria, they have a certain level of impact that they're seeing in the classroom that warrants special education. That's how a child would qualify. Like Rachel mentioned, sometimes, the interventions aren't always as specific, or the description is always as specific because it's called a specific learning disability, but they have to just identify in what area. So they might just say in reading. Schools provide interventions and IEP services if a child qualifies. And then something that parents sometimes seek out if the school does an assessment and they disagree is an independent education evaluation, which is you request from the district if you have a disagreement. The district decides to fund a private assessor doing an additional evaluation at no cost to you. And the school assessment also is at no cost to you. It's important parents know that. With a private assessment, you are getting a diagnosis, and it is parent driven in the sense that we are working together as a team, and there's a timeline that we can kind of work together on, whereas the school's timeline is usually 60 days. And then there's recommendations for home and school. Schools evaluations usually stay in the school-based recommendation realm. And then I always encourage parents to provide a copy of my report to the schools. Schools need to consider it if you provide them information, especially an outside diagnosis. So I always recommend parents use that resource and share information, because we're all working together as a team. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel to talk about a couple more things. I know it's 7 o'clock and we haven't gotten to our Q&A, so if you can hang in there for a few more minutes. And like I said, this is a recorded webinar. We will be sending you the recording, so if you have to pop offline, you'll get the recording and you can listen to the Q&A and the remaining parts of our presentation. So thank you for being accommodating and listening to what we have to say.
All right, and I'm just going to go through this last piece very quickly, and you'll have the slides so you can have more of this information. So the final question that we want to make sure that we address is, now I have a dyslexia diagnosis, what do I do with that? How do I help my child? So it's important that that parents understand that there are very specific protocols for dyslexia. Skip to the next one really quick, Meredith, and we'll come back to this one. So Orton-Gillingham is the gold standard for dyslexia. This was a program that was developed in the 1930s and has been developed over time, specifically for treating dyslexia. There are many different types of Orton-Gillingham programs, and you can show the next one really quick, Meredith. These are just a few of the programs. Actually go forward too.
Oh, sorry.
No problem. So at Learning for All, we use Barton Reading and Spelling, which is an Orton-Gillingham based program for remediation. Some of the other ones, though, that you'll see are Wilson Reading, Slingerland, Spire, All About Reading, Sunday System. There are actually about 30 different approved Orton-Gillingham programs. And if you go to the International Dyslexia Association website, that you'll see their link on the resource slide, you can get a whole list of those programs. But Orton-Gillingham, the reason we use Orton-Gillingham is because it's specifically written for dyslexia. It follows a different scope and sequence than how we typically teach reading in the classroom. And if you know anything about the schools, you know there are all different ways that schools teach reading. Just different districts, different states use different methodology. So this methodology works for all learners, but it's the only system that works for students with dyslexia, and here's why. So go back to Meredith, it ticks all these boxes. So no matter what kind of remediation you choose for your child, it has to be these things. It has to be evidence-based. So it has to be based on that we can show with longitudinal testing, pre-post testing of students, that A student comes in with these deficits, they get this remediation, and we see this kind of progress. So having that evidence base where in the research is very important. It has to be multisensory, and this is probably the most important piece. So you see that VATK. We receive information through our senses: visual, auditory, tactile, what we touch, kinesthetic is movement. So in order for students with processing disabilities to learn new information, it has to be given in multiple modalities, multiple sensory inputs. Our kids with dyslexia aren't struggling with reading because they haven't been exposed to reading. They've been exposed to a lot of reading, and they've been exposed to a lot of reading instruction, but it hasn't stuck for them. Why not? Because it was not multisensory. It was just visual, it was just auditory, it was disjointed. We didn't pull it all together. When you're using an Orton-Gillingham system, you're using all 4 of those inputs at the same time. And we don't know what hook the brain is going to be able to grab onto and remember that information, but if we can give it to a child in multiple modalities, fully integrated, that's another point, okay? Systematically, where it builds on itself, and sequentially, one step at a time, and we can give it to them in a way that's mastery based, so we don't move on to a new piece until they've mastered the present one, and we have to make it explicit. So kids with processing disabilities will not just pick things up by osmosis like neurotypical learners will. Most kids who are taught to read have some specific reading instruction, but most of their reading learning just comes from being around reading and just doing it and working on it and seeing other people do it. And they're able to get a lot of that information just by exposure. Students with processing disabilities do not pick it up by exposure unless it is explicitly taught with direct instruction. That child will not be able to understand and synthesize and remember that information. So all of these things are important in any kind of program for any type of processing disability. It has to check all these boxes in order for it to be an effective intervention for your learner.
Okay, thank you. So there's a resource page as well for you with some great websites that go into more information about dyslexia in terms of if you want to know more about treatment, assessment, just things you should be looking for as a parent. And then there's some references as well. And now we can get into our Q&A portion. So I'm looking at the chat. Sorry, I have 2 computers here, so I'm not ignoring you guys. So I see that there's a question about the hours for dyslexia assessment and the cost. So I'm happy to take that one. So if a parent is looking at a catered assessment just for dyslexia and we're not doing the full cognitive battery, social emotional piece, they want a targeted assessment looking at dyslexia, looking at the reading abilities, the processing areas, and I usually do that with reading and writing from the academic portion. That cost is $700, and then it's about 4 to 6 hours of assessment depending on the child, and then you get a report with all the information with recommendations and a diagnosis. And then if you're that compares to like a comprehensive psychoeducational evaluation, which would be looking at a full cognitive battery, variety of processing areas, full academics, social, emotional, behavioral, all that information integrated. That is usually about 8 to 12 hours of in-person assessment potentially, and then there's a lot of other hours behind the scenes that are put in to make sure the report is comprehensive and taking all those pieces of the puzzle and putting them together with interviews, observations, rating scales, all of that. And that runs between $2,500 and $3,000. And right now we're doing 20% off assessment for summer. So I just wanted to mention that as well. So there's another question from Amanda Lee. I don't know if you know who she is, Rachel. She's from the center. She's the center director for Brain Balance. I've met her before. She's lovely. So they work a lot with students with dyslexia, ADHD, trying to improve like neural pathways through a multisensory approach. How do you work with other programs like theirs?
Yeah, so we do a lot of work with other professionals, and I think that's one of the most gratifying parts of what we do at Learning for All is being able to provide a team approach to a case, a student's case who has learning challenges, because often we'll see learning challenges in a lot of different areas. And that's one of the things that we love about working with other professionals, that we're really able to address the whole child. So sometimes I'll get a student who has, a severe visual processing deficit and they need vision therapy. And sometimes they need that as a precursor to educational therapy, because once they are able to strengthen some of those visual perceptual pieces, then they'll be able to much better synthesize something like an Orton-Gillingham program for reading. When we work with audiologists, we work with other types of clinics like Amanda's, so that we can provide comprehensive care for a child and make sure that we're meeting all of their needs. We work a lot with OTs, with speech therapists, with physical therapists, and with psychologists as well for counseling, because as Meredith said, those comorbidities can be very complex and require a multifaceted approach. And so we love to have that collaborative relationship with other professionals, where we will get a family, if they're willing to sign a release of information that allows us to consult with each other, then it can be a really beautiful opportunity to make sure that we're all on the same page and pulling in the same direction for a child.
It definitely takes a village. There's another question about the role of teachers in an inclusive education curriculum. I'm not really sure. Maybe they can expand upon what they're asking about. Role of teachers in an inclusive education curriculum. So maybe they're talking about how maybe general education teachers, or how teachers can include ways to support students with dyslexia. Do you have any tips and tricks you'd recommend to general education teachers, Rachel?
Yeah, that's a whole nother webinar too. But I think the first step is just getting educated, that teachers, and I think, so oftentimes students struggle in their educational setting, and it's not always the teacher's fault. Teachers want to help kids. You don't go into education for the money. you go into education, you go into teaching because you have a passion for what you're doing, and you love the students and you love learning. And so teachers are there because they want to help kids. They just don't always have the resources to do it. And that's one of the reasons that I love to do these webinars, and we do a lot of professional development and other types of community outreach, so we can raise awareness about dyslexia, so we can educate both the public and professionals about dyslexia and about how to help. So the most important thing is making sure that teachers have access to the information. So you could share a webinar like this, or links to some of these other pieces of information that could help them. But there are tips and strategies, and the short answer is that we want to see a structured literacy approach to reading being applied across the board in all educational settings. And so if you're interested in sort of that advocacy piece, join the International Dyslexia Association, and you can help us advocate for a structured literacy approach to reading, because structured literacy works for all learners, not just students with dyslexia, but some of the other methodologies that are used in schools definitely don't work for kids with processing disabilities. So if we can rethink how we teach reading, and if we can have early intervention and early assessment at kindergarten and first grade, and we can flag those students who need extra attention and extra work in structured literacy, then we could go a long way to preventing kids from getting lost in the special education system in the public schools.
Agreed. Yes, that every early intervention is so crucial, and identification. And there's different ways schools can use different tools to screen children to see if there's a concern in reading. Jenny brought up a good point. You can always collaborate with educational specialists that are on campus. Those are like your special education teachers. If they have the background to train or give you tips and tricks for working with kids with dyslexia. You just want to make sure that someone has a foundational background and knowledge, because like Rachel shared, there's certain facets that may not always, that children with dyslexia need, that may not always be incorporated in an intervention or program that the school is using. Okay, let me see if there's anything else.
I have one here for you, Meredith. What's the difference between a psych ed evaluation and a neuropsych evaluation?
Great question. So there can be a lot of overlap. A neuropsychologist has a different set of training than what I have, but we have a lot of overlap in training as a licensed educational psychologist. So as a licensed educational psychologist, I'm very much looking at that educational component, and I'm looking at how the cognitive abilities really can affect that academic performance, and then that social emotional ability. And there's usually a school component and a lens that is integrated that looks at how the child's going to perform learning wise and interventions that come with it. So like I said, there's neuropsych assessment is really focused on that those neurological abilities. A lot of times we do have overlap in assessments, so our assessments can look similar. We give cognitive batteries. They also give academic achievement batteries and processing batteries. Their interpretation may be more in the neurological realm as well. And so there's just different kind of styles, I would say. And so it really just depends on what you're kind of looking for as a parent. We can both diagnose. We both can give IQ tests. Like I said, a lot of similar batteries, and our just approaches may be a little bit different depending on because of our trainings and our background.
And last question, Meredith, came from Jeanette. She says, my dyslexic husband who speaks 4 languages wanted me to ask why we think dyslexics have trouble speaking other languages. And definitely that's not true across the board. Clearly, your husband is an example of that. But I would be curious to know if he can write in all 4 languages that he can speak, because typically, students, again, we talk about different types of dyslexia, so different types of dyslexic learners have different profiles and different strengths and weaknesses. If the dyslexia is more visual based, then somebody could potentially have a much easier time speaking languages, but have a much more difficult time putting those into writing across the board. And it could also be vice versa. So again, there is no one size or one piece. When you're looking at that list of red flags, no one dyslexic learner is going to have every single one of those checked. But you will know that you should be looking for dyslexia. If you're checking, more than 50% of those boxes, that's a good clue that, that you might want to dig further and see if there is some kind of processing challenge happening there.
Yep. Great. So I don't think we have any more questions. It's 7:15, and so I want to be mindful of people's time as well, and just say thank you to everybody for taking the time to be here tonight. I know we went over, so thank you for bearing with us and listening, and thank you for submitting your questions. And a recording will be sent to everyone who registered. So thank you for joining Empower Child Learning and Learning for All. We're really excited that you were here tonight. Thank you.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.